What would you do if the quiet meal you prepared with your whole heart became the moment a house stopped feeling like a shelter and began to feel like a family? That evening did not begin with tears, betrayal, or a dramatic confession. It began with smoke rising gently from a small stove, with vegetables being sliced by careful hands, with the faint scent of fresh wood still lingering inside a newly built hut. Yet beneath that calm simplicity lived something much deeper. Tu Tien was not just cooking dinner. She was offering devotion in the only way she knew how, through effort, through warmth, through the humble art of making others feel cared for. Then Jack walked in, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped into her small world without ceremony, helping her not as a guest to be served, but as someone who wanted to stand beside her in the ordinary. And when Tu Tien quietly asked him if his mother could join them, the evening shifted from romance into something gentler, riskier, and more profound. In that wooden hut, under the last gold light of day, food would become more than food. It would become acceptance. It would become belonging. It would become the first fragile shape of a home that none of them had dared to name aloud. The hut was still new enough to hold the scent of its making. Fresh wood breathed softly through the narrow walls, mingling with the smell of dry leaves carried in from the forest and the faint earthy coolness of the evening air. Thin blades of golden sunlight slipped through the gaps between the planks, laying warm stripes across the floor and across the small stove where the fire had only just been coaxed awake. Nothing in the hut was grand. The table was simple, the shelves modest, the utensils few, but there was something deeply tender in its incompleteness, as if the place were still becoming itself, still waiting to learn the rhythm of the lives that would fill it. Tu Tien stood alone before the stove. Her sleeves were pushed back slightly. Loose strands of hair had slipped forward near her cheeks. In front of her were the ingredients of a meal that, to another eye, might have looked ordinary: vegetables washed and set aside, meat ready to be seasoned, herbs laid out with quiet care. But in her hands, the ordinary always became something more. She did not rush. She sliced each vegetable with steady concentration. She rinsed, sorted, seasoned, stirred. The knife met the cutting board in a calm rhythm that seemed to belong to the hut as naturally as the crackle of the fire did. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, the only sounds were the flame, the knife, the quiet clink of bowls, and her own breathing. There was peace in that stillness, but not emptiness. Tu Tien's thoughts were full. She was thinking about the meal, yes, but also about the person she hoped would taste it with genuine pleasure. She imagined his face when he stepped in, whether he would look tired from work, whether he would notice the care she had woven into every dish. The thought alone warmed her from within. She smiled to herself without realizing it. There are many ways love reveals itself. Some people speak it easily. Some try to prove it through sacrifice. Tu Tien, perhaps without fully knowing it, expressed it through nourishment, through watching a pot carefully so it would not burn, through balancing flavors so one bite would comfort rather than merely fill, through building tenderness into the smallest parts of an evening. As the aroma of cooking slowly filled the hut, the space itself seemed to change. What had only hours earlier been a newly built structure of wood and effort began to feel softer, more lived in, more human. The scent of food curled upward and settled into the walls, as if claiming them gently. The hut was no longer just shelter, it was beginning to hold memory. Then Jack arrived. He did not enter with noise. His footsteps were measured, his presence calm in the way it always was when he had finally stepped out of the world's demands and into a place where he could be himself. He paused at the doorway for just a moment, taking in the sight before him: Tu Tien in the golden light, the fire alive, the small stove breathing warmth into the room, the air fragrant with something rich and homelike. Something in his expression softened immediately. All day, he had belonged to another rhythm. Work, responsibility, Deadlines, decisions, the outside world knew him as CEO Jack, and he wore that role with discipline. But here, inside that hut, standing before the woman quietly cooking with all her heart, he felt something unravel inside him in the gentlest way. The weight of the day loosened. Without saying much, he took off his outer jacket and rolled up his sleeves. That simple gesture changed the atmosphere more than any romantic line might have. He was not here to be served. He was not here to watch from a distance. He stepped closer to the stove and, after a brief glance toward what she had already prepared, began helping her as naturally as if he had always belonged in that kitchen beside her. He washed vegetables. He stirred the pot when she needed both hands for seasoning. He handed her what she reached for before she had to ask. His hands were larger, rougher in their strength than hers, but he moved with surprising care, adjusting himself to her rhythm instead of disrupting it. That was what made the moment intimate. He did not enter her world as a man taking over. He entered it as someone willing to follow her lead. Tu Tien looked at him once, then looked away quickly, smiling. His presence warmed the hut in a new way, not only because another body had entered the room, but because the silence between them became alive with shared purpose. They spoke in brief exchanges, at first small remarks about work, a question about whether the soup needed more salt, a quiet laugh when steam rose suddenly and made them both step back. But underneath those words moved something more tender. Jack found joy in the simplicity almost immediately. He watched the way she tasted the broth with complete seriousness. He noticed the care in how she arranged ingredients, never wasting movement. He listened to her explain a small detail of seasoning as though it mattered, because to her, it did. And because it mattered to her, it began to matter deeply to him too. The wooden walls, lit by afternoon gold, seemed to gather the warmth around them. Cooking together in that hut became more than helping with dinner. It became a kind of rest neither of them had known they needed. A refuge made not of silence alone, but of companionship inside usefulness. Responsibility and tenderness, side by side. At one point, Jack paused and looked up at her fully. Steam rose lightly between them. Her cheeks were warmed by the fire. A faint shine of effort glowed at her temples. Yet what struck him most was not her tiredness, but the quiet light in her expression. She looked happy in the work, deeply, sincerely happy. He told her then that her cooking smelled wonderful. The compliment came without performance. His voice was low and warm, and the sincerity in it reached her more powerfully than if he had said something more elaborate. Tu Tien's cheeks colored almost instantly. She lowered her eyes for one moment, but she could not hide the joy that moved across her face. It was such a small thing, a compliment in a hut over a pot of food. Yet, small things are often the most dangerous and beautiful in love, because they slip past defenses more easily than big gestures do. Jack's words made her heart flutter, not because they were poetic, but because they were real. He was not flattering her, he was admiring her, not only the food, but the care behind it. From then on, even their simplest motions carried more feeling. When he reached for a bowl, she noticed the warmth in the way his hand paused near hers. When she leaned past him to check the flame, he stepped aside with a kind of instinctive gentleness that made the space between them feel charged. The hut had become, without either of them naming it, a place where ordinary tasks revealed extraordinary closeness. Then, with a shy smile that barely hid her courage, Tu Tien said something that shifted the whole evening. She told him she wanted to invite his mother to join them for dinner. The words came softly, but they carried weight, not because the invitation itself was complicated, but because of what it meant. Tu Tien was not only thinking of the meal or the evening, she was reaching towards something larger, toward family, toward acceptance, toward a bond that extended beyond the two of them into a wider circle of belonging. Jack looked at her in surprise, only for a second, then his face changed. The surprise melted into something deeply touched, almost humbled. He had not expected that wish from her at that moment, and perhaps because of that, it moved him even more. He smiled and nodded, his eyes warmer than before. In that nod was agreement, gratitude, and a recognition of the bravery beneath her gentleness. The hut seemed to grow quieter around them, as if even the air had noticed something meaningful had just happened. While the food continued to cook, the emotional shape of the evening changed. This was no longer only a tender moment between two people learning the language of domestic love. It was becoming an opening, a gesture towards something like family, however fragile, however new. By late afternoon, Jack's mother arrived. The light outside had grown softer by then, more golden, more forgiving. When she stepped into the hut, she brought with her not tension, but a calm curiosity touched with warmth. Tu Tien greeted her respectfully. Jack moved at once to help settle her inside. Then, without any awkwardness that lasted too long, the three of them began preparing the table together. It was a simple table, a few dishes, bowls set carefully, utensils laid out with modest precision, but the act of arranging it together filled the hut with a warmth far greater than decoration ever could. Laughter began to appear more easily now. Short comments, small jokes, little moments of cheerful correction when one reached for the wrong dish or placed something in the wrong corner. The room, once quiet and full of the private intimacy of cooking, now became fuller in another way, richer with shared presence. Jack's mother watched the two of them often. There was something unmistakably soft in her eyes. She saw Tu Tien moving gracefully between stove and table, attentive and sincere. She saw her son, usually contained, unusually light in this space, helping without impatience, smiling without reserve. It was the kind of scene a mother notices not only with the eyes, but with the heart. The sunlight painted their faces in gold. Food fragrance spread through the hut, mingling with the scent of wood and spice. What could have been an ordinary dinner now felt strangely sacred in its quiet way. Not because anyone said so, but because everyone there seemed to feel that something beautiful was beginning to bloom. Then they sat down together. Jack's mother in the center of warmth, Tu Tien and Jack on either side. The three of them gathered around hot dishes while the last light of evening slanted through the hut's gaps. The sound of bowls being lifted, chopsticks touching plates, and gentle voices speaking over food created its own delicate music. It felt like a family even before anyone dared call it one. Tu Tien served carefully. Jack made sure his mother was comfortable. His mother accepted each gesture with a warmth that made the whole meal gentler. There was respect in the air, but not stiffness. Care, but not performance. The simplicity of the setting only made the feeling stronger. Nothing was hidden behind formality. What was present was sincere. As they ate, both Jack and his mother praised the food again and again. The compliments were not exaggerated. They were genuine, spontaneous, and affectionate. Jack's mother smiled with visible pleasure, and each time she did, Tu Tien's heart relaxed a little more. What had begun as a hopeful invitation now became something real. Her cooking had not only been accepted, it had brought joy. Jack looked at Tu Tien with gratitude so open that it almost startled her. He understood what she had done. This dinner was not just a meal, it was an offering, a bridge, a quiet act of courage disguised as hospitality. And because of that, every sincere word spoken at the table carried far more than approval of the dishes. They carried recognition of her place there. The meal continued in warmth. Conversation flowed in easy, modest ways about the day, the hut, the food, little things that seemed unimportant on the surface, but were essential to the atmosphere underneath. With every passing minute, the hut felt less like a newly built space and more like a lived one, the kind of place where affection could root itself and grow quietly. By the time the final dishes were nearly empty, the golden light outside had begun to fade. Evening settled softly around the hut. The last brightness slipped from the walls, but the warmth inside remained. In that warm afterlight, with laughter now quieter and gratitude deeper, Tu Tien felt something she had not wanted to name too quickly: belonging. Not perfect certainty, not possession, but a deep, delicate sense that her presence there mattered, that the food she made, the care she carried, the sincerity she offered, none of it had disappeared into silence. It had been received. When the meal ended, no one seemed eager to rise immediately. The moment itself asked to linger. The hut held them gently, as if aware that this evening would remain in memory long after the dishes were washed and the fire had gone out. Jack's mother still wore that quiet, contented smile. Jack still looked at Tu Tien with that same warmth that had first softened when he entered the hut and saw her at the stove. And Tu Tien, though shy as ever, felt a steady glow within her that no longer came only from the fire or the lamplight. It came from being seen, welcomed, and allowed to offer something of herself without fear. And perhaps that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Sometimes the most meaningful turning point in a love story is not a kiss, a proposal, or a dramatic rescue. Sometimes it is a meal cooked in a wooden hut at the edge of evening. Sometimes it is the moment a woman stirs a pot with all her heart, a man steps beside her without taking over, and a mother sits down at their table and smiles. Love becomes deepest not only when it is spoken, but when it is shared as nourishment, respect, and a place at the table. In that small hut, under fading gold light, romance quietly transformed into something stronger, something closer to home.